Mia versus Kamla. Split among Caribbean leaders over Venezuela, last week's 80th anniversary meeting of the United Nations General Assembly revealed a significant split between the leaders of the English-speaking Caribbean about the future of our region. With the ever-looming specter of a U.S. invasion of Venezuela and 14 civilian non-combatants being killed in Caribbean waters by the American military, most of the leaders who made speeches at the UN were forced to state their position on the growing instability in the region. In the recent past, the heads of government of the various islands, as part of the Caribbean community, CARICOM, could be trusted to sing from the same song sheet, with the usual differences in tone, rhythm, and rhyme. But this time around, there were diametrical differences in content, exemplified by two of the most prominent women leaders in the region. Prime Ministers Mia Mottley of Barbados and Kamla Persad-Bissessar of Trinidad and Tobago. Mia Mottley may not be the current chairperson of CARICOM, but she is highly regarded throughout the region and often designated as spokesperson for regional governments. In her address to the United Nations, she expressed alarm that the Caribbean is being turned into a zone of conflict. Quote, "What is even more, in the Caribbean Sea, we're now seeking a shocking violation of a hemispheric understanding that the Caribbean be treated as a zone of peace. There has been a buildup in military assets in the last few weeks in the Caribbean by both sides, by the United States of America and by Venezuela. That any such buildup could occasion just an accident, and if it does, a simple accident can put the Southern Caribbean at disproportionate risk. I need not tell you, therefore, what a war can do. It is not acceptable for our islands, our countries, to be viewed as collateral damage." Unquote. On the other hand is Persad-Bissessar, a veteran politician and two-time Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, who, by the way, has attended meetings of the World Economic Forum, WEF, and featured speaker at a 2010 event, has an entirely different perspective from Mia Mottley. Quote, "The notion that the Caribbean is a zone of peace has become a false ideal. The reality is no such peace exists today for too many in the region. Peace is not daily life, but an elusive promise glimpsed and never grasped." Unquote. She justified her nihilistic attitude to peace on the grounds that there is violence at home, which translates to instability and war in the region. Her country's inability to stem the growth of violence and killings over the past 10 years is the justification for making the Caribbean a zone of war. Apparently, domestic violence translates to international violence. By this logic, the Caribbean should never aspire for peace in interstate relationships based on our growing homicide rates. According to a Substack post I made in early 2025, quote, "In 2023, a phenomenal 11 Caribbean countries were in the top 20 in global homicide rates according to the Statista, the data-gathering website. While Jamaica was the leader in absolute numbers and second in homicide rates, the much smaller islands, their relatively puny population size, have catastrophic murder rates." Unquote. Why a zone of peace? During the Cold War era, the Caribbean was frequently a site of superpower conflicts, including U.S. military interventions, such as the invasion of Grenada in 1983. More significant than Grenada, in my opinion, was the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis between the USA and the USSR. The entire region, especially islands like Jamaica, the Caymans, and the Bahamas, were facing absolute destruction if the two superpowers did not pull themselves from the brink of nuclear war. These events underscored the region's vulnerability and spurred calls for a permanent peace status. Caribbean leaders have repeatedly advocated for the Caribbean to be recognized as a peaceful, sovereign zone free from foreign military bases and interventions. Ironically, it was Persad-Bissessar's predecessor, first Prime Minister of independent T&T, then Premier Eric Williams, in a 1959 speech, when declaring opposition to the continued U.S. military base at Chaguaramas in his country, first articulated the need for a zone of peace. His 1960 speech, "From Slavery to Chaguaramas," is a foundational statement on this concept, opposing U.S. military bases in the Caribbean and asserting Caribbean sovereignty against external military presence. The principle has been repeatedly upheld by Caribbean leaders like Errol Barrow, first PM of independent Barbados, and remains central to regional policy, particularly within CARICOM. It encourages the Caribbean nations to resist becoming embroiled in global power rivalries and wars, and to protect sovereignty and regional stability. The formal regional proclamation came in December 1990, when the presidents of Central American states declared Central America, including the Caribbean, as a zone of peace, freedom, democracy, and development, aimed at removing superpower rivalry from regional waters. This commitment was further solidified in 2014 when the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, formally declared the entire Latin American and Caribbean region a zone of peace. This declaration was more than symbolic. It pledged peaceful dispute resolution, respect for sovereignty, rejection of foreign military intervention, and the absence of foreign military bases. Will the Caribbean stand united on principle? Since the mid-1980s, the CARICOM has avoided being embroiled in America's wars of aggression, including the Panama invasion of 1989 to 1990. This is despite a significant Jamaican and Barbadian diaspora in Panama. The Americans did not need logistical support from the Caribbean except for its Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands possessions. But Venezuela is a different kettle of fish. Trinidad and Tobago is the closest Caribbean neighbor of Venezuela, only 7 kilometers between them at the closest point. Based on the U.S. playbook, which I discussed in my recent Substack, prior to invasion, the U.S. usually engages in international diplomatic efforts to justify the action, impose sanctions, or build coalitions. From the evidence, T&T is now part of the American coalition. In almost all her public statements, Persad-Bissessar is fully on board with the U.S. plan, openly advocating the violent death of civilians who the U.S. declare to be drug traffickers, and going so far as to refute her country's long-standing advocacy of the Caribbean as a zone of peace. Also on board with T&T is Guyana, which is in direct conflict with Venezuela over the latter's territorial claims. President Irfan Ali, in his address to the UN General Assembly, stated, quote, "We have endured repeated threats and aggression from the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and despite the fact the territorial controversy was before the ICJ, which had ordered Venezuela to refrain from actions that changed the status quo, it still persisted with unilateral laws and the threat of annexation." Unquote. Meanwhile, Mia Mottley is allied with Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. According to his speech to the UN General Assembly, quote, "St. Vincent and the Grenadines call for the scaling back of actions and rhetoric which are so inimical to cordial neighborly relations. In particular, we find the foreign militarization of the waters around Venezuela exceedingly troubling. Repeatedly, the countries of the Caribbean and Latin America have unanimously declared our area a zone of peace. We urge our American friends to abide by this declaration." Unquote. In conclusion, between Mia and Kamla, we are witnessing 2 distinct tendencies among Caribbean political leaders. On one hand is Mia, representing a patriotic nationalist tendency, which is opposed to U.S. military domination of the region. On the other is Kamla, who is a globalist together with the former Marxist-Leninist PPP of Guyana under Irfan Ali, representing those who see no alternative to unrestrained American economic and political domination of the Caribbean. Over 40 years ago, the patriotic nationalists, who led the region to political independence, were decisive in seeking non-alignment from the superpowers and to neutralize CARICOM involvement in U.S. warmongering. After the fall of the Soviet Union and America's temporary reign as the sole global hegemon, the Caribbean has had no choice but to compromise with the U.S. on regional security. The Venezuelan conflict has again exposed the difference between these 2 political tendencies. A Caribbean divide has opened up. How will the U.S. aggression versus Venezuela further affect Caribbean politics? Thanks for listening. Remember to like and subscribe Caribbean Hawk on YouTube and Substack.